Okay, welcome everybody. We are going to get underway and hopefully our keynote will join us. If not, we will be able to present in his stead. So my name is Alex DeSherban. I'm one of the co-coordinators of the Population Environment Research Network, along with my colleague, Susanna Adamo. This is the 21st of a series of cyber seminars that we've conducted going back to 2001 when the PERN network was first launched. This one is unique in that it covers the topic of culture, beliefs, and the environment, which is an area that has been little studied by demographers and by geographers and others. But we are going to hear from a few researchers in sociology, demography, and geography and other anthropology and other subject areas who have in fact been looking at this topic. First, I want to acknowledge our network sponsors, Future Earth and the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population. I also wish to acknowledge the NASA Socioeconomic Data and Application Center, which provides in-kind support for this network. Both Susanna and myself are based at CESIN, which is the Center for International Earth Science Information Network at Columbia University, and one of our major projects is this NASA Socioeconomic Data and Application Center. And lastly, I want to acknowledge as a co-sponsor of this particular webinar and cyber seminar, the Columbia Aging Center at Columbia University. So by way of introduction of the overall cyber seminar, and then we'll next proceed to the actual webinar itself. We are in a world that's facing dramatic demographic shifts, and these are associated with different cultural values and belief systems. For example, in the industrialized countries, there's rapid aging, which is sometimes associated with greater adherence to a religious affiliation of various types. And in the developing world, there is, one moment. Apologies for that. Vigard Skirbeck, who's our keynote speaker, was just trying to reach us by Skype. Hi Vigard, we'll get you on in a minute. So we are also in the developing world, as I was saying, there's very young populations and rapidly growing populations. And so religion and culture and belief systems are all relevant for how the world both addresses and is confronted by environmental challenges, changes, and hazards. The topics that we are going to address today include culture, attitudes, and values as they relate to perceptions of the environment. These same sort of things, culture, belief systems, and values as they relate to environmentally significant consumption patterns, religious beliefs and their implications for age structure and population growth, and how religious and other beliefs vary by population composition, and lastly, how vulnerability and perceptions of risk relate to different demographic groups. I want to acknowledge that we have several expert panelists who are part of this cyber seminar, including Raya Matarik, who's at IASA in Vienna, as well as the Vienna Institute for Demographic Research, Richard Wilk at the University of Indiana, Tom Dietz at Michigan State University, and Richard Schwamm at Rutgers. At the end of this, I'm sorry, it's not Richard, but Rachel Schwamm. I apologize for that. At the end of the cyber seminar, after our presentation, we can take questions in a comment box at the lower right-hand corner. So if you have questions along the way during the presentation, please make a note of those in the comment box in the lower right, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible before the hour is up. So let me just break now for a moment to check with Vigard to see if he's having technical issues. Okay, can everybody hear us now? We apologize. I believe that the microphone is now working.
Just make yourself a participant, or just if it's working, leave it.
Just show the screen.
Just so
Show the PowerPoint. That's all you have to do.
no, hold on. We have to Adobe Connect now. This one doesn't have a host. There you go. Okay, can you hear us now? So sorry about this. Type something. There. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah, just make that small so you can see if you're still working.
I would start from the beginning of your presentation. So go back to the beginning of your.
Okay, it seems that you didn't hear absolutely anything about of the presentation, so I'm just going to very quickly to start over, if you allow me. So let's just start with why we're paying attention to the global religious belief in this particular presentation. So we mentioned that religion is a fundamental identity marker, is also part of the self-understanding of behavioral person, is affect lifestyle, the physical and mental health, and also relates to a sense of community, the willingness to transfer resources to common goals, and to participate in risk-sharing systems. Now, as Alex mentioned, we are in a time of global environmental challenges, and these also coincide with rapid religious change. And this change in religious belief can have implications for how environmental risks are perceived, and for which response are more efficient or not. There has been some research on this area, and that is what we are going to be going through now. Just let me be sure that you are actually listening. Yes, it seems that it is. You are listening. So what the empirical funding show so far? So part of the funding are that countries with greater GDP tend to be less religious overall, have greater emissions, face rapid aging and low population growth, and in contrast, developing countries or countries with a lower GDP tends to be more religious, have lower adaptive capacity, and be younger in terms of age structure and with growing populations. Other research show that religious affiliation may be associated with susceptibility to natural disasters, and also in the aftermath of such event, people could turn to religion to cope with tragedies. And this kind of funding also could be stronger in less developed society, where religion plays a bigger role in the provision of social and health services, and where environmental risk could be even greater. Because of this funding, there is the impression that aligning environmental policy with cultural values could increase the likelihood of success. But in some secular countries, often technologies and policies are advocated without taking into account what is the religious context where those technologies and policies are going to be applied or implemented. And for example, in the case of India, where 99% stated religion in the 2011 census, sustainability policy is often aligned with spiritual aims. Other research looks at belief and fertility behaviors, and religious affiliation could influence family formation patterns, also the childbearing timing and outcomes, net of the usual confounders. But also fertility is also important because children tend to resemble their parent, and so this could also affect overall population growth in the long term. And religion may also increase the importance of other fertility determinants as fertility trends converge, as is happening in more developed countries. Other research has looked at belief and environmental behavior with a growing consensus that the challenge for addressing climate and environmental change cannot be only met through technical solutions, but that human behavior, attitude, and consumption pattern will play an important role in the climate solutions. I'm sorry. And the appropriate responses can be hampered by societal and psychological barriers where these are not taken into account. And these are basically related to culture and belief. Because of this, a more holistic approach has been advocated going into social science and given a vital role in terms of addressing normative issues such as social justice between groups and response to the prospect of global warming in general. For example, the 2010 US General Social Survey data suggests that among the Christian religiosity relates positively to pro-environmental behaviors, but not to pro-environmental attitudes or beliefs. And the societal cohesion is often lower in countries or in areas where populations concerned are a lot more diverse. So this is the framework. This is the state of the are now. And this is our background for going into this paper. First, I want to mention the data on religion that Alex mentioned when he was presenting Vega. So this data on religion came for the concern about the lack of knowledge on the demography of religion, despite the high academic and popular interest in the topic. So a significant effort was made to collect and harmonize more than 2,500 surveys, registered, and censuses, and carrying out regional and global analysis based on this particular data set. And this religious faith project is a global first, and it includes demographic detail and religious view at global scales. And the estimate of the religious distribution cover now more than 99% of the global population and also include Asian sex distribution. And they are also taking into account religion-specific global growth migration flows, age-specific fertility, intergenerational transmission, and conversions. So this is the baseline of data set that we're using. But also for this paper, we also add environmental indicators for impacts and outcomes, and also socioeconomic and demographic indicators. And you can find detail of the data sources in the background paper. A particular mention is about the religion categorization that we use in the paper, and we look at the single dimension of religiosity, that is affiliation, religious affiliation, because we didn't have all the global comparative data on other aspects of religion. And we so far have 8 religious categories we're looking at. And the religiously unaffiliated is a very heterogeneous group that includes secular population, atheists, and agnostic, as well as people with no declared religious affiliation or who fail to identify themselves with the categories that the census of the survey provide. So overall, these are the spatial distribution in terms of countries and in terms of the share of the global population in the different religious group, the major religious group in each country in 2010. So we have a majority of Christians, followed with Muslim countries, and then unaffiliated is the third larger category. So overall, 85% of the world population declares to have a religion, and there is a very specific spatial distribution, as you can see in the map. However, these affiliations are not static, and these are part of the projection that we mentioned before. This is the expected estimate and the projection to 2060, and some of the religion affiliation seems to decline and others increase into the future. But also some of the difference that are among the religion now are becoming more in terms of the within the religion, and this on the right, you can see the age distribution of religious group in 2010 and 2050, and they follow in overall the general global trend toward an aging population. And some groups are aging faster than others. Similar with the unaffiliated populations, there is a very large unaffiliated population in the Asia-Pacific area related with China being one of the countries, defining as majority unaffiliated, but also in Europe and in North America and in Latin America. So now we are turning to what are some of the very preliminary results that we found. And remember, the draft that we have now is a draft for discussion. So we are very much welcome every input or any comment that you can have and questions, of course, too. So the first is what is the connection or how we can put together income distribution by religion. And we can see that in 2010, 2030, and 2050, and in every of these time period, we see that Christian and unaffiliated are the ones that have the largest income, followed by Muslim countries. These trends remain over time. There's not a major change on that. And we can look also in the map that in addition to have a different distribution by religion, also within the religions, the GDP is quite varied. We look at different countries. We can see in South Africa, being quite different from Eastern Africa, the same in Latin America, and the same between Muslim countries. Similarly, and because there is this well-known connection between GDP and emissions, we have that there is large emissions in terms of not only the majority of the country population, the largest religious group in the country, but also in terms of the region where these countries are. And we have that Christians are very prominent in terms of emissions, but also Muslim countries. And this is partially due to the kind of variable that we are using that is taking into account the production of oil that is very high in Middle East. And again, there is a large variation within each of these religious groups in terms of the intensity of the emissions that we have. And also, and this is just going into what are some of the environmental impacts in terms of how each of these countries is prepared, or at least according to this index, is prepared to face climate change and other environmental risks. This is the GAIN index from Notre Dame University. And also in terms of water stress, although in this case, what is a very clear determinant that is related to where the countries are in relation to the drylands of the world. So we have some of the largest water stress going into the dryland in North Africa and Central Asia, but also in terms of the countries that are on the arid diagonal in Latin America. Another demographic shift that is also important to consider is median age. So how is the age structure within each of these groups? And again, median age has a lot of variation within each of these groups, although there is, in general, countries in Africa and in each religion tend to be younger. That's just the global trend. Then we start looking at several of these different indicators or variables together. So we start right now just with some of the correlations, and we are showing here just some partial results that we get in terms of the correlation. So one of the things in the upper panel, that's the outcomes in terms of emission and emissions per capita. We have that if we look at just the total religious affiliation, that is the proportion of the country population that declare any kind of religious affiliation versus no religious affiliation. And we have a significant relationship, but not very strong, and it's a negative. So the larger the percentage of religious affiliation, the lower the emissions. And also this holds when we go to per capita, although in this case the significance is marginal. And then when we look at the impacts in terms of the World Risk Index and the Gain Index, in both cases, in the first case, we have that the percentage of the country that is show religious affiliation is positively related with the World Risk Index. So the larger the religious affiliation, the larger the risk, and inversely related with the Gain Index, because larger numbers in the Gain Index show a better situation. But when we factor in age, one of the things that we start seeing is that this relationship between the age structure, emissions, and resilience or vulnerability is actually very similar across different religions. We are showing here Christian and Muslim countries, and if you look at the coefficients, they're very similar, regardless of the other major difference that we have in this country. But in terms of age is a very strong relationship with this, and aging actually is one of the larger across religions relationship between outcomes and impacts of the environment. So this is our presentation so far. In terms of the conclusion, the paper identify and describe a preliminary relationship between environmental challenges and cultural factors, particularly religious belief structures on a global scale and at the country level. Certain specific religion and non-religious groups contribute to climate change differently, as measured by emissions, are unevenly exposed to the impact because of the relative development status, but also location of the countries, and are unequally prepared for the consequences of these impacts. So our findings suggest that religious affiliation relates to age structure, to GDP, to greenhouse gas emissions, to energy use, to gross domestic product, and to other indicators of adaptive capacity. And overall, secular nations seems to contribute relatively more to climate change and to be better prepared. And conversely, countries with older population and of all religions appear better prepared for climate change. So again, this is a highly preliminary analysis, and we need obviously more extensive research and analysis for this. But I think that even with this preliminary analysis, the growing importance of cultural markers, such as religions, is necessary to take into account to understand the relationship on the global scale. So this is the presentation so far. We just want to remind everyone that we can follow the discussion then the usual way in our cyber seminars. So now this is the presentation. So now we are ready to take questions. And thank you for your patience.
People typing.
Mm-hmm.
So we noticed some people are typing in the chat box, and so we welcome your comments. Vigard Skurbeck is actually online, and he may be able to respond to some of those comments in the chat box. We're not going to try to attempt to switch microphones again. That seemed not to work so well, so we're constrained, I'm afraid, technologically. So here's a question from Roger Mark D'Souza. Welcome, Roger Mark. Are there any attempts to determine how religious beliefs affect the public policy space for environmental policies, and particularly regarding climate change? And then I'm going to raise a second question by John McEwen. To broaden on environment beyond climate change, how about analysis with ecological footprint rather than greenhouse gas emissions? So I like that latter comment, and I think that, John, we can certainly address that and actually run some analyses during the cyber seminar itself. We also received some data from the Pew Center on Climate Change Attitudes Towards Policies. So that partly addresses Roger Mark's question. So we just received them over the weekend, and we plan to do a little bit of analysis. It's only a 40 country sample, but we'd like to see whether attitudes towards climate change and willingness to accept policy provisions that would limit greenhouse gas emissions are in fact correlated at all with religious belief systems. For Roger Mark's question, I don't know if Vigard wants to add anything in the chat box in terms of his own experience in this area, but I think there's no doubt that the prevailing religious beliefs, and one of the limitations, I should say, of our study, but one that I think is apparent, is that we use countries as a unit of analysis. So countries obviously are composed of multiple religious groups in most cases, and ranging from unaffiliated to Hindu, Muslim, Christian. If you think of the United States or many Western democracies, there are often a plurality of religions. But the majority religion often dominates politically, and so I would imagine that there's a strong correlation between, for instance, one of the issues we address in our background paper is willingness to pay for environmental services, willingness to pay for environmental protection or greenhouse gas mitigation efforts. And one of the things that research seems to indicate is that there's a less willingness to pay where the polity or the sense of belonging or the sense of actually sharing a common identity with your neighbors or with the people who are co-citizens with you in your country are different than you are. So that's something we bring up in the background paper, which can again be obtained from the PERN Cyber Seminar page. See what other questions we have here. We have one. Vigard responds, many countries outside include religion in discussions and policy development, e.g. in India, align spiritual aims in environmental discussions. So I think there's other countries. I've been in part of discussions even in China, which is a largely secular country, but where they believe, in a sense, Confucianism, which is not a religion per se, but is a sort of a philosophy, guides, in a sense, what they believe about how to achieve environmental aims. What is the proposed, Rick Wilk asked the question, what is the proposed mechanism collecting religious affiliation with environmentally related measures? So that's a good question, and actually Vigard or Susanna may want to answer that in a second. I'm going to look at Kofi's question. Kofi Awusabo Asare, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name. At the global level, one can possibly observe the conclusions, but the overlap between religion and other variables have been observed. A paper on religion and infant mortality raised a question. What has religion got to do with it? The finding was that education was the underlying issue and not religion. The second is the differences within broad religious groups on environment, and these would have to be considered. I think one of the things you're raising, Kofi, is the fact that we may be conflating in some cases. There are disadvantaged groups within society, and in some cases those strongly co-vary with religious affiliation. So where there's exclusion, economic or otherwise, that occurs, indeed, it may be that it's associated somehow with religious affiliation. So in some ways, using religion as a predictor is not perhaps the most clean way of doing this. But I think as a first cut, we've raised perhaps more questions than we've answered, but I think these are some important questions and issues to address. And I would say to Rick Wilk that the same applies, that in essence, it may be that there's other underlying factors that are relating or causing some of these factors. One thing we sought to do was look at Muslim and Christian nations, majority nations, separately. That was one of the last slides that Susanna presented. And that's in part because these two majority country religious groups really represent a huge and broad spectrum of economic development, from some of the poorest Christian nations in Africa to some of the wealthiest in Western Europe and North America. And then you have also the same in Muslim countries, very poor countries in West Africa, for instance, and highly developed and technologically sophisticated countries in the Middle East. Let's go down, scroll down a little bit more. There's a few other observations.
So Vegard has responded to
Vegard
Bill.
responded. Why don't you go ahead, Susanna?
So Vegard has responded to Rick Bill question. Religion can be a powerful determinant of collective actions and willingness to pay, alter behavior. I also want to say about the question, Rick. We were trying to, I mean, we tried several like statistical analysis in order than this, and we found some of the correlations hold when we are doing the regression analysis with multiple variables, what others know, and that's where we started finding some of the confounders that, as we mentioned, but some of the religious variable that we are using still hold, even when adding GDP, population, the extension of the area of the country, and age. That is one of the most important. So we're still testing some other issues, but we think that there is something there we still need to pierce out exactly what is the relationship we're looking at.
So one of the other things
Yeah.
that Vegard raises, Vegard, by the way, is VS in the chat box, Vegard Skirbeck, is that religion is very tied often, or can be tied to fertility preferences. So whether one believes that it's right or not to control fertility can sometimes be dictated by or influenced by religious affiliation and by the theology or the practice of religion in different countries. Roger Mark asks a good question, and this is a point we bring up in the background paper, is that we have countries that are majority religious affiliation, for instance, Hindu. I think Mauritius is one, which is tiny by comparison with India or, yes, and in Mauritius being Hindu and India both being Hindu. They're each treated equally in our analysis, and that would be something that we might want to tease out is there a size effect, or to what degree are some of the results, would they be stronger if you excluded some of the smallest small island states? But I think a larger question that Roger Mark is addressing is whether or not these indigenous belief systems. I think there is a category in our analysis of folk religions,
yes.
And there's very few folk religion dominant countries, but you could look at countries with significant proportions of folk religions and identify if there's distinct differences or patterns among them. John McKeown asks, also there's a need for smaller scale study differentiating within religion. The U.S. Christians are very diverse in their eco-theology. In fact, that's something we address in the background paper, that there are even, evangelical Christians who are strong environmentalists and who have launched environmental movements within evangelical Christianity in the U.S., which traditionally, in some ways, has been perceived, at least, to be less concerned about environmental concerns. So they're very strong diversity, and one of the points we make in the background paper is that there may be greater differences within a given religious category than there are between them. So Adams asks, I think finding correlation between secular and climate change is easier, as a spread of Abrahamic religions across the world moved with trade and commerce with little regard for the environment, because they are more into spirit man and supernatural beings residing outside Earth's sphere. Raya Mutarak says, about mechanisms.
Going back to
yes,
Rick's
question. Religion affects belief. Disasters are acts of God. Reduce disaster preparedness. This is actually a point that Raya makes in her background paper, so I'll put a plug in there for that. And then it also enhances social capital, and I think this is a sense of belonging, and networks of religious groups can actually really assist at times of disaster. Both, we see it around the world that religious groups often organize to help in times of natural disasters. And I think this question of social capital in terms of adaptive capacity is something that I personally am beginning to see more and more crop up in the literature, that belonging, being part of a social group, being part of a community, generally enhances people's adaptive capacity in times of disaster or environmental in face of environmental risks. Jane O'Sullivan says the country level correlations understate the extent to which wide variation exists within religion. So this is a topic
Totally
that we've
agree.
addressed, and we totally agree. Biophilia, or its relative absence, is not necessarily bounded by religion.
Mhm.
It is more useful to focus on specific religious influences on particular barriers to more environmentally sustainable behaviors. I think we would agree that it's really important to dig beneath these sort of global correlations to understand what's driving and what kind of theology in particular is really driving. And I think that's a rich area for anthropologists and environmental sociologists and others to explore. Bigard says regarding
The question by
Kofi
Agusama.
earlier,
Yeah.
even when accounting for education, income, religion is often found to affect environmentally relevant behaviors. Recent studies using instrumental variable approaches to overcome endogeneity issues suggest religion has a causal effect on lifestyles, and in some cases determining behaviors, influencing education and workforce participation, for example, particularly among women, and consumption behaviors and health. And then again, small scale studies will bring out the issues traditional religions in Africa have had strong inbuilt environmental beliefs. And that's certainly true. However, such groups do not feature because of numbers. The small groups could cope better with others due to their numbers and their belief systems. So this has been really rich. I think this has brought out and actually covered a number of issues we knew were probably going to be brought up because of the nature of our analysis. And one is always somewhat at risk when one starts to delve into questions of religion because what do they say? And over dinner, that's not considered polite conversation. So we're stepping out into that a little bit and taking that risk because we feel it's an important topic. I think there may be one or two more comments, but I'll just segue now to say that we really appreciate everybody sticking with us during the technical difficulty that we encountered earlier. And we do hope that you will continue to participate in the cyber seminar online using the listserv, which you can find out more information about by going to the PERN Cyber Seminars webpage, and you can subscribe yourself or simply email us at pernadmin@season, CIESIN.columbia.edu. That's pernadmin@season, CIESIN.columbia.edu, and we'll be glad and happy to subscribe you. There's one or two more comments with these analysis. Which will you recommend, biocultural conservation management or central government conservation management approach? I think that's a really good question, and I think that's one that we could easily bring up during the cyber seminar itself. I've been involved some in community-based conservation efforts through my prior affiliation with IUCN, and I understand the importance of local involvement and really the importance of belief systems in community conserved areas and even religiously based conservation, say sacred forests and that sort of thing. So those are really important points. We thank you all for joining us today, and we will be opening up the listserv to counter any.
I also want to say that we are recording the whole session for those that could not join us because of the different times and other issues. So we're going to be posting a record and also the question that we are receiving today and on this question and participation.
So thank you very much. Thank you to Vigard, who valiantly tried to get online earlier and was unable to do so, but we're glad he got on in the end. Thank you to Susanna Adamo and to all the expert panelists who also took time to join us, Raya Mutarak, Rick Wilk, among others. Thank you, and we will be ending this webinar momentarily.